Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm really happy to be here today with you all, as I am every day that we have a webinar, because I enjoy being in community and learning with you all. Today, we have an exciting presentation on Nonprofit Management 101. This presentation is brought to you by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar and their nonprofit subject matter work group. Anytime that I co-host anything with the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar, PILS for short, so if I say PILS, that's what it means. I always want to give a shout out for folks to join, because it's an incredible community of lawyers who are dedicated to public service, who come together, share their ideas, and really do what they can to promote the public sector. So if you are interested in being in nonprofit law work, public interest work, or even if it's just something you want to just be a part of, please consider joining PILS. I'm going to put a link into the chat to get you to that webpage to help you join. And as always, you can always reach out to me directly if you have any questions. So before we get into introductions of our speakers that we have here today, I want to go over some housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, this webinar training was approved for CLE credit. I will announce that CLE code at the end of the training, so don't worry, it'll be put in the chat. I'll also say it out loud, and it will also come to your inbox in 24 hours from an email from Zoom. More on that Zoom email. That Zoom email that will come to you within 24 hours will also have a copy of this recording. We know that you're all busy putting out fires, doing important things, and sometimes you might have to hop off. That's okay. If you have to hop off early, you will still get a copy of the entire recording along with the CLE information. If you don't see that hit your inbox in 24 hours, just email me. I'm going to put my email into the chat, and you can just reach out to me for anything that you need. Second piece of housekeeping announcement, maybe the last, we'll see. If you have questions and answers, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. I know we're shy. I know this virtual platform doesn't allow for the most interaction, but your thoughts, your feelings, your comments, your questions are important to us, and it facilitates a good dialogue. So please feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A or the chat. Our speakers are going to pause at certain points within the presentation to answer your questions as close as possible to the subject matter. So don't be shy, drop them in. I always forget something on housekeeping. It's the most boring part, I know. So I'm going to move into introductions, and if I remember something later on, I will definitely bring it up at the end. But so moving into introductions, today we have with us Anna Frusciante. Anna is co-founder of FC Law, specializing in providing legal services for tax-exempt organizations. Anna is also Associate Counsel at Citrus Health Network, a nonprofit, federally qualified health center and community mental health center serving adults and children in South Florida. Prior to this, Anna served as Director and Co-General Counsel of a nonprofit organization that grew to become the largest women's shelter in the country. And prior to her in-house work, Anna was an attorney at Legal Services of Greater Miami. We also have Charlotte Cassell. As co-founder of FC Law, Charlotte is dedicated to using her legal experience to support nonprofits working to change communities for the better. Charlotte began her legal career as an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Florida Legal Services. She also has extensive experience, having worked for numerous nonprofit organizations in both a legal and non-legal capacity in Miami, Washington, D.C., New York, and San Francisco. Most recently, Charlotte has worked at Health Information Project and Lotus House Women's Shelter. I'm incredibly honored to share this platform with Anna and Charlotte, not only for the work that they've done in the nonprofit world and that they continue to do, but I'm always grateful when our legal aid community or prior legal aid servants come and provide training and be a part of this initiative. So Anna, thank you. Charlotte, thank you. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alexis, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I want to thank you, Alexis and Florida Legal Services, for pulling this together, and of course, Jeffrey and PILS for inviting us to speak. And we really want to thank each of you for joining us. We know that your days are busy, and that's probably an understatement. So we're really grateful to have your time and look forward to a really engaging and fun conversation. We will have our contact information at the end. So please, like Alexis said, ask questions throughout. But if there is anything you want to reach out about after, we would love the opportunity to talk more. So I want to start with a quick poll. So Alexis, if you can help me here, we just want to get a sense of what made you interested in joining us today for the CLE. Is it that you work at a nonprofit, you're on the board, you represent a nonprofit, you want to get involved? And then of course, we know that there are some people who want a CLE credit. We've all been there. So just be honest, we just want to know who's in the room today.
And we'll give it a few minutes. Well, not about a minute or so. Let me know when you think we should cut it off. And thank you all for participating in the poll.
All right, so it looks like most of you work at a nonprofit organization. So hopefully we have some information that we can share with you today that you don't know, or answer some questions you might have. I love to see that about 20% are interested in getting involved with a nonprofit. So hopefully we can answer some of those questions that you might have about what you might be thinking as you decide about whether to get involved or not. So we will stop the poll. Thank you all for that. Oh, do I share? All right.
Did you see the results? I'm so sorry. I thought I shared them.
I saw the results. So
here we
about
go.
60%, yes, 60% work at nonprofits, about 20% are interested in getting involved. Handful of you who are here for the CLE credit, and then some of you who are on the board of a nonprofit or represent a nonprofit. So a good mix, pretty much what we were expecting, and hopefully this is helpful for all of you.
Would you like me to take the results down?
Yes, please.
Perfect.
So I'm sure each of you, when you're reading the news or watching the news or on the internet, have seen the headlines about various scandals across the country about nonprofits that get in trouble. So usually this is financially related, not always, but there's usually some financial component to the scandals or the problems that arise. And just as an example of kind of how pervasive this issue is, there's actually a landing page on the New York Times website where you can input information that you have about the mismanagement of nonprofits. So clearly this is something that people are looking into. There are stories being written about it. And it's not really surprising because these are public dollars, essentially. So these are dollars that have a very specific purpose. The nonprofits are set up to serve a specific purpose. So different entities want to make sure that they're being regulated appropriately. So our goal today is not to scare anyone, but really to give you the highlights of what you should be on the lookout for, or what you should know when it comes to nonprofit management. We know in our work, both working at nonprofits and with nonprofits, almost everyone, if not everyone, is there for the right reason. So the people who found nonprofits, the people who work at nonprofits, the people who are on boards of nonprofits are there because they care about the mission, they care about what that organization is doing. But because these dollars are so closely scrutinized, it's really important that someone is overseeing what is happening. And what happens when problems arise is that it erodes public trust. So as you can see in the slides here, there really is an issue, and it seems to be growing with the public's trust in nonprofit organizations. So in this first report here, only about 20% of Americans report having a high level of trust in nonprofits, which of course means about 80% do not have a high level of trust. And about 60% of respondents said that the financial responsibility of nonprofits serves as a deterrent. So that might be with them donating or getting involved in some other capacity. And then in another recent study that took surveys of people between 2020 and 2022, saw a drop in trust of nonprofits from 59% to 56%. And while that might not seem like a huge drop, it was actually a statistically significant number. So I think this just shows that there are issues with nonprofits, but with the proper oversight and management, a lot of these issues really can be avoided. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna now to give us our first example of a nonprofit that went a little bit awry.
Thank you, Charlotte. So yes, we are going to go into a few, I wouldn't exactly call them case studies, but some of the stories that have been in the news as of late featuring nonprofits to highlight some of the topics we're going to talk about. So first thing we're going to talk about is some of the basic duties of a nonprofit board. We realize many people on the call are not on the board necessarily, but maybe you get questions about this. Maybe you work with the board a lot. And for those of you who are on the board, just to cover some of the basics, we're going to start with a nonprofit you may or may not have heard of called Wildlife in Need and Wildlife Indeed, Inc. This is also known as WIN. And the founder of WIN is a man named Tim Stark, who you may know as a supporting cast member in the American classic Tiger King documentary. He had a nonprofit that purported to be a rescue for animals. He had over 300 animals, many of them exotic animals, on his property. There were a number of issues with the actual substance of the work he was doing. He was a wildlife trading partner with the actual Tiger King, Joe Exotic, and then he was accused of animal mistreatment on numerous occasions. But that is not why we were talking about WIN. What really happened with WIN is that he was operating this nonprofit on his own personal property, which is not necessarily in and of itself a problem, but he was using the money, Tim Stark was using the money from WIN to pay for house repairs, his own personal utilities bills, his personal credit card bills, and it eventually turned into, in essence, a private slush fund for Tim Stark. I think all of us can easily agree that that's not appropriate, and we wouldn't want to be involved with any organization who was doing something like that. But the challenge came in because it turns out that the board of WIN was really not involved at the level they should be. And that is what kind of allowed a number of these things to go on for years, actually. So the state of Indiana, which is where this nonprofit was located, ended up becoming involved and tried to dissolve the organization. And we'll talk a little bit about exactly what the board was and was not doing at the end, but we just kind of wanted to tee that up to talk about some of the basic duties of a nonprofit board. And we'll use Florida law for our starting point here. Chapter 617 of Florida statutes covers not-for-profit corporations. There's a lot of overlap with Florida law on, in terms of the substance of a lot of the things mentioned here are the same as the for-profit statute, but a number of things are different. So the board of directors is a group of persons vested with the management of the affairs of the corporation, irrespective of the name they're designated by. So, it could be trustees, managers, some places might call it members, but essentially the board is charged with the governance of the organization. And in nonprofits, typically the boards are volunteer boards, and the board members have fiduciary duties to the organization. So that's higher, of course, everyone on the call is a lawyer, that's a higher duty than just your regular duty person to person. So the duties of care and loyalty the board has to the organization, and then sometimes they'll break out something called the duty of obedience. And that's really being aware of the laws that govern the organization, being aware of the organization's own policies, and having your eye out to make sure that they're actually complied with. So the IRS they'll look at the governing board quite a bit, actually. If an organization is applying for nonprofit status, a lot of questions will be asked about the board, any interests the board members might have, any anticipated agreements the board might enter into with the organization. And the IRS has published quite a bit of guidance on on some guidelines in terms of how a board should be comprised and the general duties of the board. So a few things we wanted to highlight. The IRS has said in one of its publications on nonprofit organizations that governing boards should be composed of persons who are informed and active in overseeing a charity's operations and finances. If a governing board tolerates a climate of secrecy or neglect, we're concerned the charitable assets are more likely to be diverted to benefit the private interests of insiders at the expense of the public and charitable interests. So for those of you who have been involved in nonprofit management, you'll know that when it comes time for a nonprofit to file their tax return every year, the 990. I'm sure there's a lot of financial information that goes into it. Your accountants prepare it. But on top of that, there are a lot of questions actually about the governing body, the board of directors, or, you know, if you have trustees or whoever it might be, they actually will ask you questions about your board each year. So that's something to keep in mind as we run through this. One topic that comes up a lot in the context of nonprofit boards is conflict of interest. And we're not saying that boards are rife with conflicts. That's not what we mean. It's just that in bringing, you know, volunteerism and a spirit of philanthropy as board members, a lot of times people can bring things like resources. Maybe they can offer services either for free or at a discount, or connections that can benefit the organization. And those are great. But in some cases, they can border into what's called a conflict of interest. So, you know, conflicts are something that could be talked about for a long time. We could do a whole webinar on that. We will spare you that. But we wanted to just highlight a few things that are important to keep in mind when you are either acting as a board member, or maybe you're just putting in place a board, or maybe you're now leadership at a nonprofit. So some things to keep in mind. One is that you want to, of course, have your conflict of interest policy, and you want to make sure every board member has read it. This might sound obvious, but sometimes in the day-to-day hustle and bustle, that can get lost. In the state of Florida, the charitable registration requirements for any nonprofit actually require that your board sign every year saying they've read the policy. So you just want to actually make sure that you have seen it in case these issues come up. And some things to keep in mind, you know, a potential conflict or the appearance of a conflict is not necessarily disqualifying. It's not necessarily horrible. It, you know, might ultimately be something that is beneficial for the organization. But the key here is really transparency and documentation. So all of the policies require it. You want to make sure for you or anyone you're aware of who might have a conflict, the key is really disclosing it and then addressing it. So a good conflict of interest policy will have a policy for addressing the conflict and a procedure. So we want to make sure these are disclosed, that the right person or body, and that the procedure for addressing it is dealt with. So there's some factors. They may or may not be in your policy. If someone has specific questions about that, we can talk about that at the end. But we just want to emphasize that if someone discloses a conflict, you want to follow the procedure, and then you want to document it either in your meeting minutes, that's where it comes up, or you could have a separate thing in writing where you say, you know, this was addressed, it's determined this was in the best interest of the organization, or, you know, the following steps were taken to protect the organization. But you just want to make sure that that documentation is happening. And then in terms of the board outside of conflicts, there's a few things that come up, and this is going to tie back to our story of the wild animal rescue in Indiana. But there's some basics on meeting requirements. And organizations have a lot of flexibility to decide when, how often, how notice goes out, who can attend, can you attend electronically or not, all that kind of stuff. Organizations have a lot of flexibility to decide, and how many people constitute a quorum, things like that. There are some defaults set by Florida statute, but your own bylaws and articles of incorporation might cover them. So Florida statute 617-0701 subsection 1 gives that flexibility to the organization. There are some best practices. So we think it's best that there's an annual meeting of the board where officers are appointed or elected every year, that you adopt a budget every year that shows that the board has an active role in looking over the finances, and then at a minimum having quarterly meetings. You might have them more often, but at least quarterly will show that the board has reviewed things periodically. Let's say an issue ever does come up that's, you know, not great. Maybe someone does something people didn't know about before. If you had your board meetings happening regularly and it was something that was, you know, picked up, that at least shows that sort of oversight and active participation. Minutes of board meetings are required. I realize that sounds maybe very, very basic, but again, it's one of those things. You might start with the best of intentions, and maybe the person who started with the best of intentions just doesn't know that. So you want to make sure that you're recording what's happening at your board meetings. So I'm going to turn it back to Charlotte to just touch on some of the things that happened at WIN where the board maybe could have, or definitely could have done better.
Thank you, Anna. And just one quick point to kind of really reiterate what Anna was just talking about with board meetings. We have heard people say, we want to keep things formal. We don't want to have formal meetings. We want this to be fun and easy for the board members, but these really are, some basic requirements that have to be met. So that doesn't mean that it has to be, sitting around a conference table in a very formal setting, but you do have to have the meetings and you do have to keep the minutes. So kind of returning to when and how the board of directors failed. So Stark was the president of the board, and he very clearly breached his fiduciary duties, and there were tons of conflicts in all of his actions. But it's also important to recognize that the board really failed in a number of ways as well. So the fact that they rarely held formal meetings, they did not take notes of any meetings that occurred, and they didn't prepare or review the budgets or financial statements was really a failure on their part to uphold their responsibility to the organization. Once they learned of the misappropriation of funds, they didn't do anything to recover the funds. So again, a failure to abide by their fiduciary duties. And ultimately, when the Attorney General was deciding what to do with this case, they decided not to name the board of directors as plaintiffs, but they did require them to file articles of dissolution and turn over all of the nonprofit's assets to another organization that was also working in the wild animal rescue space. So with Stark as president, they really failed, he failed, and the board as a whole failed to live up to their responsibilities to protect the organization. So I will pause there for a second, and Alexis, if we have any questions about boards specifically, we can take those now.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure if this is directly to boards. I apologize, but I'm going to read it out loud because it came in. Please discuss the benefit of requiring the organization to provide D&O insurance for officers and directors. If that's something that you want to address now or later.
I'm happy to just touch base on that.
And if you want to.
Can you repeat it one time, Alexis, just to make sure?
Yes, of course. Can you please discuss the benefit of requiring the organization to provide D&O insurance for officers and directors? Thank you.
Sure. There's a few benefits. We are, I think probably a lot of people on this call feel similarly as lawyers. We're very in favor if you can insure something and it's affordable to do it. A lot of times directors and officers insurance is affordable. It's really, it's a kind of rainy day situation. You hope it's not something that you have to use, of course, but let's say something did happen at the organization that somehow implicated the board. It doesn't necessarily mean the board did something wrong, but you want to have insurance in place to address even the allegation that the board did something wrong. So substantively, it can be beneficial because let's say someone who's not on the board, maybe a staff member did something that ultimately results in a claim and somehow the board were named. It would be great to have insurance to cover that, even if it's ultimately not something that the board should be liable for. And then secondarily, that having director and officers insurance can really help in recruiting for your board. So some of your more savvy or seasoned people who have been involved in nonprofits, that's probably, or maybe one of the first questions they ask. People want to know hey, I'm doing this as a volunteer. I really care about your cause, but let's say something does happen that I couldn't foresee or couldn't prevent. They want to know that they're not personally going to have to be, defending a lawsuit. And conceptually, I think that kind of makes sense. So I'm not sure, there's all kinds of little particulars we could get into on what the policies cover. You want to ask some questions, it would be great. That's something maybe talking about offline, because that can get insurance coverages in that area can get pretty nitty gritty, but those are some of the basic reasons you'd want to have it.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. And there weren't any other questions. I just want to say I'm loving the Tiger King case study throughout.
Yes, it feels, as we're all emerging from our COVID years to bring back the Tiger King for a minute. So I'm now going to move into another story. Now that we've talked about the board and the really important role that they play in providing guidance and oversight for the organization, we want to talk about financial compliance more broadly. So I'm going to share a story out of Massachusetts. I will share the details and then we'll kind of get into what went awry in this situation. So in July 2021, a woman in Boston was sentenced to 6 years in prison, 5 years of supervised release, and ordered to make restitution to 2 nonprofits that she had previously worked at and defrauded. So for 5 years between 2013 and 2018, this individual stole almost $1.5 million from a nonprofit. She did this through unauthorized wire transfers, unauthorized checks, and some of those checks she made out not only to herself, but to her husband and other people that she knew. She pled guilty to the charge and was ultimately released. But by the time that happened, she had already applied for a position at another nonprofit in an administrative capacity with access to financial documents. And she did not disclose her prior indictment, unclear as to what sort of background check they ran or didn't run. But she did intentionally use her maiden name and not her married name when applying for that position. At the second nonprofit, she stole $57,000, again through unauthorized wire transfers, changing the name of payees on checks and cash transfers to herself. In December 2020, she was charged with embezzlement from the second nonprofit. And as I mentioned, had some pretty significant charges as well. So of course, the impact of this on the nonprofits was huge, in particular, the one where she stole $1.5 million. Even large nonprofits losing $1.5 million really impacts the services you're able to provide. So clearly this was a negative impact on the organization she was working at because they didn't have the resources to do what they wanted to do. It was clearly criminal behavior on her part, but it also highlights how either not having the right policies or not following your policies can have some very serious negative consequences for the organization. So we don't know what policies and procedures these 2 nonprofits had in place. We don't know if she was, if they had nothing in place and she just was doing this on her own. But it is clear that, she was able to get away with this for quite some time before it rose to the level where it was brought to the attention of management and, outside individuals. So I'm going to turn it back over to Anna to talk a bit more about financial controls and how organizations can protect their funds.
So a few things just at the outset here. I want to be clear, I am not an accountant. And so we're not endeavoring to give, detailed accounting advice, but there are general policies that should be in place that can help protect organizations. There's some things you want to look out for. And in the world of nonprofits, the overlap between funding and actual services is so deep because a lot of the funding received in order to do the good work has either contracts that govern it or regulations that govern it. So they really go kind of hand in hand in the world of nonprofits. So some of the things that we want to talk about are just like, what are you kind of looking for when you are managing your finances? In the for-profit world, maybe you have a small for-profit company, maybe you have your own law firm, something like that. I mean, many times no one's going to look at your books. No one cares if you have a receipt from your, lunch or the tablecloths you bought or whatever it might be. But in the nonprofit world, the finances of an organization can be looked at many times over by many different organizations. So for those involved with organizations that receive government contracts, state, local, or federal, a lot of those funding sources involve actual audits where the expenses will be reviewed in detail. Other times it might be the board asking questions, and that's a good thing. So it's great to have an active board who is another set of eyes, but you want to actually have things to substantiate what is in your books. So a few things that tend to be more common in the nonprofit world, and they really are best practices, are one, that you want to have backup for the various expenses and revenues that you're receiving. So you want to have those receipts. It's not, never an easy thing to, you have a lot of staff to get them to turn in receipts and things like that, but nonprofits do it for a reason. Those who have been around a long time know that you might actually need that to qualify or to receive some grant funds you are entitled to. And otherwise you might need it for just regular audits and things of that nature. So keeping your backup is important. And another thing that happens with nonprofit accounting that is kind of unique to the industry is that the expenses get tracked by their funding source or the program that they were used for. So if your organization receives federal funds, or maybe it's county or state funds that originated from the federal government, that's actually a requirement in applicable federal regulations that your expenses are, or that your revenues and expenses are tracked by the program and the funding source. This, for some, it might sound obvious, and for others, this is really not something you might do at the outset. What we think is really helpful is not to necessarily get into like how you're going to keep your books, but to just say, if you have access to an accountant or a bookkeeper with experience in nonprofits, that can go a long way. Another thing that can go a long way is doing this at the outset. So you might say, like, it's all private donations, there's nothing to really track. That basically could be true, but a bookkeeper or an accountant with nonprofit experience will be able to get your books set up so that if you do get some of those bigger grants or contracts, you'll easily be able to kind of drop them into your accounting methods. And then another thing you want to look at is what rules are even covering the funding that you're getting. So a few things. If you get money from the state, there's going to be the state of Florida, there's going to be a certain set of rules. Different state agencies have their like very specific rules on how the funding can be spent. So the key is to look at your contracts or your grants and see what they say on that topic. Another thing we want to say, and we've just seen it happen a number of times, is having a contract, and this is again very often with like a county or a state or a federal grant, where the grant just says provider will comply with, let's say, 2 CFR Part 200. And that seems like a fairly innocuous statement. It's one line in a very large contract. Doesn't seem like much. All we would say is you want to make sure that especially if you're just starting out with government grants, that you take a look at the contract and actually look up the regulations, or have someone who involved with the organization or an attorney look them up to tell you what you're agreeing to, because what you don't want to do is have agreed to certain financial or accounting practices at the outset that aren't actually in place, and then have to deal with the fallout from that later. So please keep your eye out for things like that. And then a few practices that can be helpful to keep in mind. And again, this can be something where maybe you didn't start at the outset like this, but as your organization grows, you want to have them in place. And this is kind of helpful when you're looking at the case that Charlotte brought up, having someone who was able to issue wire transfers to the tune of millions of dollars that somehow were not picked up for years. So as you grow, you want to have the payment process diversified among different staff. So you don't want one person who can write checks, sign checks, and then review the financial statements every month to make sure things look okay. That would be problematic, because that person could easily, or maybe not even that person, but something that is inappropriately done could easily be covered in that situation. Another thing that you want to look out for is making sure that you have a system of checks and balances with reviewing the statements. So, maybe 2 people review statements every month, or maybe one person does reconciliations and another person is just kind of looking at the profit and loss and seeing the financial activity. And then you want to make sure that the financial statements go to the board. So that's one of the key things the board will be doing. It's not that the board is expected to look at every transaction. We don't want to create an unreasonable impression here for what the board is supposed to do, but it is important that they're receiving reports and that these reports do have some explanations attached to them. And then another thing you want to look out for is, and this is again where you might see some variance from the for-profit world, is getting the expenses actually booked. And I know that sounds very silly, but again, nonprofits tend to operate on thin margins. They don't have a ton of administrative space to, pour over the books every month. But what can happen is that time flies, and expenses that might not get booked timely can result in these large accounts either stuck in suspense, or maybe they were put into an account called other or something like that. And the issue with that is that as time goes on, maybe your board takes a look at the books and says, that looks weird. Why do you have all of that money in other? What is other? And if you don't have notes over time, you might not even remember what it is. So you want to make sure that things like that are happening. And so We want to just bring up another current event in the world of nonprofits that just arose very recently. This is a shelter for people experiencing homelessness in San Francisco, and they have been doing work for many years. What happened is, I guess, that the city they received millions of dollars in state and city funds for providing shelter and food. And over time, there were some questions about their books. Some of their 990s started showing expenses like, let's say, almost $500,000 in, were booked as other with very little explanation. And so there were requests for financial documentation. And instead of kind of trying to tackle it head on and either addressing any issues or providing the detail that was needed, they didn't respond to these requests. And so without responding to the requests, the issues sort of snowballed. And so they ended up having their nonprofit status revoked. It looks like the city is, they're still operating, but they have a really, really big headache ahead of them now. And a lot of this with some stricter financial practices could have been avoided. The matter has even been addressed for criminal investigation. But anyway, we're going to talk a little bit more about this organization because they also got audited for their programmatic documentation, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I think that's it on some of the just basic concepts on nonprofit accounting. Alexis, I don't know if there's any questions on that.
The only question that I saw that came in, I think it was something that you had mentioned, was what is the Florida Green Book?
So, well, we've seen a few different versions of this, but sometimes if you receive a grant from a particular state agency, they might have you just want to look out for it in the contract or in some of their training requirements. They might have some of their financial guidelines in something called the Green Book. There's also some programmatic guidelines that are there's something referred to as the Green Book. So we don't want to get too in the weeds, but we brought that up to say that in Florida, if you get a state grant or state funding, you want to look out for that phrase, because if you say that you're going to comply with it, there's usually a training the agency has on that. And it just has some guidelines for operating your grant and in many cases on the finances.
All right, and I did see that there was another question that came in through the Q&A. That was from the chat. This one's from the Q&A. What procedures do you follow if you suspect funds may have been misappropriated by an employee? At what point do you refer the matter to the state attorney?
That's a great question. I can't speak on when it might go to the state attorney. It depends what angle you're looking at this from. So if you're a board member who starts having questions, you have a lot of ability to ask for things as a board member. If you're not getting things or you're not getting responses, that could be a red flag. If you are within the organization and you're saying, you're looking at the books and you're like, maybe something was a little off one month, but over time you're going like, this just does not look right. I don't understand this. You definitely want to be asking questions of the folks who helped put the reports together. If you're the person putting the report together and it doesn't look right, I would speak with leadership, meaning like your either executive director or whoever, operating officer. What you could do is try to get a recommendation on this, like a third party start looking at the book. So this would fall maybe short of something like a full-blown forensic audit. That's something that you can get privately, but you might start out with someone who has experience in the area who isn't already involved, saying like, where is the issue? Like, what is the issue? What do you see? So I would start there. And then, I think it would be very fact dependent on whether someone within the organization or on the board felt like something needed to be alerted to the authorities. So I wouldn't want to kind of give any kind of general statement on that. Sure.
And there, no other questions, just a comment. Great stuff. Thanks for this. So back to you.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm sure everyone here saw the headlines, not too long ago about Brett Favre and the volleyball stadium that he had built at the University of Southern Mississippi, where his daughter was a volleyball player. We're not going to get into his specific role in the incident. He has denied knowing where the funds came from. There's ongoing litigation there. But we do want to talk about what can happen when grant dollars are not used for their intended purpose. And this especially comes into play when we're talking about government dollars. It applies to all funds, but of course there is additional scrutiny when we're talking about federal, state, or local dollars. So this was the largest public corruption scandal in Mississippi's history. So in a very quick summary, what happened was the executive director of the Mississippi Department of Human Services provided federal funds. So these were the temporary assistance for needy families, also known as TANF dollars, to 2 nonprofit organizations in the state. So that in and of itself is fine. But where it became problematic is he then ordered those nonprofit organizations to fraudulently award contracts to various entities and individuals across the state for social services that either weren't in line with the intended use of the funds or services that were never provided. So one of these funds was the Mississippi Community Education Center, and it used $5 million of TANF dollars to help build this volleyball facility at the university. For those of you who don't know, TANF are federal dollars that are given to states, municipalities, or nonprofits, and they're to support various services for low-income families with children. So it's a pretty specific purpose or group of people who should be receiving them, and volleyball facilities at universities would not fall within that intended purpose. So it probably, and I would hope sounds obvious to most of you on this call, that grant dollars, when they're given for a specific purpose, must be used accordingly. They must be used for that purpose. So if an organization receives a grant for a specific purpose and no longer needs the funds for that, it's okay to talk to the funder and say, can we reallocate this? Can we do a budget modification? There are reasons when that is appropriate. But the key here is that you have that conversation with the funder before you decide to reallocate those funds. So I would say, don't go with the adage, ask forgiveness, not permission. You really want to be asking permission and having that all documented in writing, through normally it's through a formal budget modification process where the funder is allowing you to use those dollars in a different way. Of course, there are times where you get unrestricted funds, or you might get a donation for something like operations and you can use it, pretty widely. But the reality is that most grants, and especially government grants, have a very clear purpose. And when you sign the contract, receiving that award, you are agreeing to use them for that purpose. When this doesn't happen properly, when you don't get the permission to use them in a different way, a lot of bad things can happen as a result. So this can result in the immediate termination of that contract. It can result in not renewing future contracts. It can have, they can ask for those dollars back, so they can claw back the funds, and it could even result in jeopardizing your nonprofit status or criminal charges. So back to our volleyball court. Thinking about what happened in Mississippi as a result of the misappropriation of funds, multiple people ended up pleading guilty to some pretty significant charges. So as you'll see in the first bullet here, the founder of that nonprofit that awarded the $5 million pled guilty to bribery, fraud, mail fraud, and racketeering. Her son, who was the assistant executive director, also pled guilty, and the accountant for the nonprofit pled guilty. So it's just important to remember that it's not just the executive director who's on the hook for these things. It is really anyone who's involved, anyone who has knowledge of what's happening, and had an opportunity to report it or fix it and didn't. And then the former executive director of the Department of Human Services pled guilty to theft and conspiracy concerning programs receiving federal funds. Not only did he give those funds to these organizations, but he was very explicit in requiring them or directing them to use them for an unintended purpose. So now that we've talked about what happens if you don't use your grant dollars, right, we want to talk a little bit about how you get those dollars in the door in the first place. So in Florida, you have to submit what's called a solicitation of contributions application to the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. You can only do that after you've incorporated in the state. The application itself is pretty straightforward. It's a few pages. It asks basic information on who's starting or who's running the organization, some contact information for the board members, Oftentimes those are one and the same. It asks information about your intended activities, what the mission of the organization is, as well as some financial information. Once the budget is approved, or once the application is approved, that's when you can actually begin going out and soliciting donations in Florida. But every solicitation that you have, including on your website, has to have this very specific language, the all caps here in the middle, letting people know that you have registered properly with the state. You also have to give everyone that phone number or the website, so that if someone does want to reach out to the department and get confirmation or get more information about your registration, they can do so. A few additional points. This is state specific. So this is how it works in Florida, but most states have something very similar where you have to apply with various state entities to be able to solicit contributions. So this is the process in Florida, but just because you do this here does not mean you can go host a fundraiser in New York and start soliciting donations there. And then the second is that this application has to be renewed annually. So it is not a one and done and you can solicit forever. You do have to fill out this documentation every single year. And Anna mentions at the beginning, this is where they ask to confirm that your board has read your conflict of interest policy. So it is, a very important document that you maintain over time. There can be some pretty significant consequences if you are found to be soliciting donations without this approval in place. So I'm now going to turn it back to Anna to talk about some more conflicts of interest.
So we talked about conflicts when it comes to being on the board or in a leadership position at an organization, but there's also a broader kind of context of conflicts where, maybe it doesn't even implicate your conflict of interest policy. Some large organizations might actually have written policies that address this, but you just want to conceptually think about when you have either receiving donations or you're otherwise getting public support as a charity, you want to just think about the idea of organizational conflicts. So this story came up very recently, and this is the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They do a lot of work in science and research and policy reports, or reports that influence policy. And in this particular instance, they had received about $19 million in donations from the Sackler family, which will sound familiar to many, but in case anyone doesn't know them, they were in charge of Purdue Pharma, which had created OxyContin, and they ended up having myriad investigations for their role in what ended up becoming the opioid epidemic. Without getting into any of the details on that, this donation to the National Academies had come to light recently because the National Academies had issued 2 in-depth reports on opioid policy and on opioid use. The reports included data and research on how many people were enduring chronic pain and the need for pain pills. And then it now has come out years later that they had received this large donation, and it was at the least an appearance of a conflict. The National Academies has issued a long statement about receiving the donation, saying that none of that money went toward the development of these reports or their work in opioid policy nationally. You really don't want to be in a situation where you are having to issue those kind of statements. And then a number of people have opined on this issue. There's someone who studies ethics and in science and research had said accepting millions of dollars while advising from the Sackler family, while advising the federal government on pain policy would be considered a conflict of interest under almost any conflict of interest policy. So we've seen things on a much smaller scale where maybe someone who, has been in the news for some serious ethical or criminal issues wants to do some, maybe publicized work with an organization. That's not necessarily a problem, but you just want to see that donations that are coming through and other support it doesn't come up often, but maybe it's something that should raise a red flag. So we did want to bring that up. And now we would like to pivot from some of the more nitty-gritty financial regulation aspect of nonprofit management to some other risk management considerations that come up. There's a ton that could be talked about in this area. We wanted to highlight some things that just come up a lot. One of those is documentation. So now instead of talking about financials, we're talking about the services an organization provides. So this could be direct services for organizations that are actually providing whatever it might be, if it's goods, if it's services, if it's support, if it's shelter, whatever that is. This also includes documentation for organizations that maybe don't provide direct services, but provide funding for other organizations or for people. Maybe your organization is dedicated to providing financial support for people who have certain medical conditions. Maybe the organization is designed to provide grants to other nonprofits. What you want to do is make sure that whatever the organization is designed to provide has the appropriate documentation behind whatever it's doing. So what are some examples of this? In the world of direct services, and again, for many, this might sound obvious, but it's not always so clear. You want to make sure that you have a record of who you served, maybe who you served, when you served, and what you did for them. Let's say someone came back, later and says something, I didn't get this and you were supposed to do this for me, or this thing you provided caused me this issue. Well, the last thing you want to do is not even have a record of what you did for the person. And that, that can come up because sometimes the people providing the direct services might not be aware of the potential for these issues to arise later. So you want to make sure that's in place. That could be things like, let's say you're going to start providing some care coordination services, or maybe you help children visit with certain family members or something. You want to make sure that you have, let's say, like a basic form where the person says, I understand this is what this organization does, and I consent to participating in the program. Like something even basic as that, where then you can say people were informed about what it is we were trying to assist them with doing. For organizations that are not doing direct service, some documentation requirements might be, let's say you're providing scholarships, or you are providing that financial assistance for people with certain illnesses. You want to have documentation of who you supported with the funds and how they qualified for those funds. So if you said let's say you said in your IRS filings, we provide financial assistance for people with this type of illness and who are low income. Well, you need to have then a record that shows that people actually met those qualifications, who you provided financial assistance for. What you don't want is that you have a lot of money going out to either people or other organizations, and then you're not able to show that there was a process followed so that it looks like, that money could have gone to really anyone, and it was sort of indiscriminately given. So if we look back at some of the things we've talked about today, the group out of San Francisco, the homeless shelter that had not responded to audit requests and had not booked their money in a transparent way, well, they also were audited on their actual programs. And so for those of you who have been receiving government grants, you know that audits are not only financial, but the audits might actually include your programs. So you might have an auditor who literally comes in and looks at program files and looks at the eligibility requirements for the program and says, hey, are the people you're serving the people you set out to serve? And in the case of this shelter in San Francisco, an audit was done and they found that 83% of the participants did not have documentation that they actually met the qualifications to receive services. Doesn't mean that they didn't meet the requirements. It's just you want to actually have that documentation in place. A few other areas of documentation that you might want to look out for. Sometimes it's appropriate to get things like releases or waivers if you're doing highly dangerous activities or risky things. You might want to have that in place. Sometimes you can't. For those of us who are at legal services organizations, you can't actually ask for a waiver in order to provide legal services. So we're not saying it's appropriate, but it might be. And then things like, let's say you post a lot on the work your organization does. If that's direct service with people your organization serves, you don't want to be posting people on your social media pages and whatnot without either consent from them or following the right process. You don't want someone to come back later and say, I really didn't agree to have my family out there to the public in that way. So another thing you want to look out for is with the IRS, sometimes they prescribe the documentation requirements. So for organizations that give scholarships, the IRS actually has like a significant number of requirements that organizations must be, in terms of documentation, organizations must be keeping. And then a few other risk management things we want to bring up. It's kind of related to documentation, but this is privacy procedures. Again, this is an area, there's all kinds of laws that govern privacy. A common one, of course, is HIPAA, but there's many others. And so we're not endeavoring to get into like privacy law itself, but we want to say that many nonprofits handle personal and confidential information of people. At the very least, you might handle sensitive information, birthdays, information about children, names, things like that, that if that information was somehow in the wrong hands, people might not be happy about that. So you want to have policies in place for handling private information. And for many organizations, they already have this, but a lot of times places don't have it. It kind of, everyone's on the same page on how you're going to keep information confidential, but it's not actually written down. So you want to have a privacy policy. You want to have this be a policy where your staff members say in writing, I've read this, you have a form that they acknowledge they've read it. And then the key there is that you actually have a training where staff, maybe when they start, or you do it each year, where people are oriented on how you're going to handle sensitive information. And along those same lines, in terms of human resources, that is a whole other topic, but you want to make sure your organization has an employee manual that people acknowledge that they have read it and they sign something saying they've read it at hire. So I think with that, Alexis, I don't know if there's any questions, but we've kind of covered the basics that we wanted to get through.
Yeah, a couple of things did come in through the Q&A. First question was, is there a checklist, resource, or website that you can recommend that can be used to ensure that a nonprofit is complying with relevant Florida statutes?
We do not have, or we're not aware of a checklist. If there is one, that's something we can look at, but I'm not aware of an actual checklist. A lot of organizations, what we've seen is they'll, at least at the outset, especially when it's not easy to pay for services, that they might have a volunteer board member or someone who's willing to donate their time to kind of do that kind of a review, but not a checklist that I'm aware of.
Would be a great resource if it's out there. If anyone has one, send it to us. And then the other question that came in is, what is the duty of foreign nonprofit corporations to get a certificate allowing them to seek donations from the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Affairs? Let me know if you need me to reread that.
I would have to look at the statute on this. It's not a long statute. It's fairly reasonable on solicitation of contributions for foreign organizations. I'm not positive, because it just hasn't come up in a while for us, but I'm not positive if they have to be registered first with the Division of Corporations in order to get that registration to solicit. So I don't know who asked the question, but Alexis, if you can connect us, that's something we can get the answer to offline.
I definitely can. Question was asked by a good friend to the training initiative. Happy to do so. So with that said, is there anything else before we go into the remainder of the housekeeping CLE stuff?
No, I think we're good. Thank you.
Awesome. No, well, thank you. It was such a pleasure to learn from you both. You both clearly have a lot of passion to make nonprofits successful and, to keep them within, doing the right thing. And this was really informative. Not only I'm saying that, but through the chat, there's lots of great stuff, very informative, and thank you. So thank you both, Anna and Charlotte, for being here and teaching us today. And with that being said, I'm going to drop the CLE code into the chat. That CLE code is 7510. And we were approved for one general CLE credit. Again, that CLE code, along with a copy of the recording, a copy of the PowerPoint, and again, the CLE code, I think I said that, will come to you via email from Zoom. Don't look for my name. It'll be a Zoom email. If you don't get that in your inbox, you can always reach out to me. And through the chat, Anna and Charlotte, there's just a lot of very helpful. Thank you. Great job. And so with that being said, unless there's anything else you all want to add, I think I'll let you go and enjoy the rest of your day, and the same for our audience.
Thank you, everyone, for your time.
All right.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, Anna and Charlotte. Thank you.
Bye.